Our next presenter is Michale Glennon. We've seen the data presented by our scientists, but is that the only way that data and impacts to water quality can be expressed? Our next presenter thinks not. Michale Glennon is a lifelong Adirondacker, and her work reflects an interest in the environment and also in the culture of the park. She's currently working for the Adirondack Watershed Institute. When I first saw the work that she will be presenting on, I immediately thought that it would be great for our SALT Summit and a different way to present the data and the way that our water quality is being impacted. So I hope that you will think so as well. So, Dr. Glennon?
Thanks, Chris. I am the science director for the Adirondack Watershed Institute. Excuse me. And generally at this meeting, you would have either our director, Dan Kelting, or our water quality program director and senior research scientist, Brendan Wiltsey, who actually do the road salt research. We are heavily involved in road salt research, but not me. I'm a terrestrial wildlife ecologist. I am a scientist. So I'm a poor replacement for either of those gentlemen, but I was really happy to come and talk when Chris asked me to come here and talk to you about a totally different topic. How do I go forward? There we go. So I love the surreptitious title that you put for me, Chris, on my presentation, suggesting that maybe I was going to show up and share some groundbreaking and elegant science and or some wonderful management recommendations, which is not at all what I'm going to do. Instead, I am actually going to talk about art. And I'm going to talk in particular about a project called Wool and Water, which Chris saw me talk about at the meeting in the Champlain Research Conference back in May. So this project is called Wool and Water. It's a data art project in which we are using fiber art, primarily knitting and crochet, but some other things as well, to represent water quality, changing trends in water quality and conditions in the Champlain Basin and in the Adirondacks. This was a bit of a crazy idea that we proposed to the Champlain Valley National Heritage Partnership as a small part of a small education grant and said, let's see what they think of this idea. And they liked it. And so 2 years ago, we started this project with funding from the CVNHP, which does care about promoting the cultural heritage as well as the national heritage of the region. And it's been so well received that we have since that time been able to leverage additional funding from the Basin Program and from Northern New York Audubon to continue this work. And so I'm thrilled to talk about it, even though it's a little bit out there for this conference and perhaps different than what you were expecting. So I'd like to generally start this talk, one, by asking people who is a knitter or a crocheter, which I'm sure is almost nobody in this crowd. Oh, right. I'm sure if you aren't, I'm sure that many of you know people who do. But anyway, I do like to give a little bit of background of why is my science and research organization involved in this project. And part of the way that I attempt to explain this is just that, you know, we sort of have this notion. I think that the neuroscience has advanced beyond this now, but we were sort of exposed to this idea that lingers, that we are either sort of these left-brained or right-brained types of individuals who are, you know, analytical people, which I fully would have put myself in that camp for all of my life since high school, as, you know, logic and math and research and all that sort of thing. Or you're on the other end of the spectrum and you are, you know, an artist and you're ruled by passion and creativity and feeling and inspiration. And there's sort of this idea that there's this giant gulf between them. And I'm a scientist, therefore I can't do art. Or I'm an artist and math is way too hard for me, for example. But I would argue that actually not only our brains, but we as individuals and communities function better when we sort of take advantage of both of those things. So this is Leah. She's the same woman that was in the previous slide. She works in our analytical chemistry lab, analyzing the water samples that we collect throughout the park to learn about stressors like road salt. And she's also an artist. This is a picture she gave to me of her in the Arctic. She has conducted research in the Arctic and also in Antarctica. She's actually headed back to Antarctica in a couple of weeks. And here she is in her beloved Arctic with her oboe. because she's also a musician. She also does painting and block printing and all kinds of cool stuff. And there, for some reason, she felt the need to bring the oboe to the Arctic and combine these two sides of her. Similarly, here I am in one of my beloved peatlands. I've been studying low elevation boreal wetlands and the birds that live within them in the Adirondacks for 2 decades. That's me wearing a pattern called the bog jacket. As soon as I learned that there existed a pattern called the bog jacket, I had to make it. Not only that, I had to put one of my target birds on it, and then I had to take it out to one of my study sites and wear it, because there's just something about combining those two sides of us maybe and being inspired by both of them. So I would argue that instead of thinking about science and art as these sort of widely disparate things, that instead maybe there is some kind of inspiration and magic that comes when we combine the two of them. And all I can say to attest to this is just that I get a more enthusiastic reaction to this project and sort of more understanding of what I'm trying to convey than to any of the hundreds of ecology lectures that I've given in the Adirondacks for the past 2 decades. So that tells me that something is working out about this. So Wool and Water is a data art project, for lack of me knowing a better term by which to call it. It is an exhibit. There's a whole bunch of stuff in this collection now that's slowly traveling throughout the region, in part with support from the Basin Program. It is, perhaps most importantly for us, an education and communication tool. It is collaborative. I'll show you examples of pieces primarily that I have made, but I am slowly corralling folks to participate in this project with me and create their own pieces that become a part of this collection. It is therefore a network of folks that I'm dragging along on this fun adventure with me. And I think one of my favorite parts about it is that it's bringing in a community of folks to participate in something that might be considered activism, but in a very low pressure sort of way. So craftivism. It gets them to think about the environmental concerns that they are worried about and maybe sort of express those feelings in a way that feels maybe less intimidating than calling up your local legislators or participating in a march. Although my ultimate fantasy for this project is that we all create some piece that has to do with road salt or whatever our top concern is, and we actually wear them, take them to Albany and knock on the doors and say the knitters are coming. I love the idea of doing that. So the items that are in the collection are a bunch of things that really have to do with our best attempts to use this particular form of art to illustrate concepts in limnology, trends, threats, the things we're worried about, all of which help us to tell our story, which is that we care most about protecting clean water and promoting healthy watersheds. That is the focus of the Adirondack Watershed Institute. So this is just a quick tour of the variety of things that are now represented in various ways in this project. And I'm gonna focus today on the pieces that have to do primarily with winter. There's just a few things with road salt. I'm constantly bugging my colleagues for road salt data and chloride information that I can play with a little bit more than I have so far. But I'm gonna focus on the winter pieces because this is a winter issue that we're talking about, and also because I tend to think a lot about things like ice and snow during the winter months, and then when summer comes, I'm instead focusing on HABs and aquatic invasive species and things like that. So we're heading into the cold times. And here's one example of those. This is a piece that I called the Champlain ice scarf. It is a representation of the freeze record on Lake Champlain. So you can get the data from the National Weather Service or right from the Champlain Basin State of the Lake report that they put out each year. They put this record in there this year. And this is just a scarf in which each row is a year from the beginning of that record, which I want to say is 1897 or something like that. It's a white light color if the lake froze, and it's a bluer color if the lake didn't freeze. The one that I made is the farthest on the left, but other folks have taken us up and made the Champlain ice scarf as well. So you imagine if you held that one up, the one that's hanging over the fence at my house, if you held it up, the older years are where we have less blue, and the more recent years are years where the lake more and more often doesn't freeze completely. And the one in the middle, if you look close, in that picture, you can see the version of it that I made. There are some white beads on one of those sort of three, columns in that particular stitch pattern. That is a representation of if the lake did freeze in the years that it froze, did it freeze in December or January or February? So within that record, the lake is freezing less often than it used to, and it's freezing later when it does freeze. So you can make the ice scarf, you can wear it, you have your climate active wear, you can say, what a nice scarf. Well, thank you, actually. It's the Champlain ice record. Let me tell you why I have this. So that's one of my favorite things about this project. Here's another one that has to do with ice. I am not much of a fisherman at all, but I can't bear the thought of living somewhere that doesn't have ice fishing. I just am so enchanted by driving around in the wintertime and looking at the shanties on the lake. And my plans for retirement include taking up fishing in all of its forms, because I'm a terrestrial person. I want to learn more about fish. But I really want to do a piece about ice fishing. And so this piece is sort of read similarly to the other one. You kind of look from top to bottom and left to right, and each of the holes is meant to make you think about a hole in the ice that you might use for ice fishing, but also a winter, in this case since 1895 and going to present time. And the ones that are outlined in that blue embroidery are winters in which the mean temperature was above 25 degrees, which is the temperature at which ice fishing derbies or competitions often get canceled. This is based on research from Leslie Knoll and her colleagues. They are at the Itasca Biological Station in Minnesota. They wrote this really cool paper about the impacts of a warming climate on the ways that we use ice, pond hockey, ice fishing, ice sculptures, all that kind of stuff. I couldn't find a record for the Adirondacks where anybody had compiled together the records of when ice fishing derbies got canceled, but I know it happens. I know it happens here on Lake George, for example. And so I just took their threshold and applied it to the weather data for our region. And so again, this is just to make you see that the winters are putting at risk one of the cultural things that we care about here. Here's another one, is the snowfall record. So if you look at the climate data, it's much harder to find consistent patterns within the precipitation trends than within the temperature trends, but this is one of the stations within the Adirondacks where there is a consistent negative trend in snowfall. So that is the snow record for Wanakina, sort of right in the middle of the park. It's a subtle trend, but it is a downward trend, and I just put it on a scarf. In this case, making sort of the background piece first and then adding the data. Again, you can imagine wearing this somewhere and strike up an interesting conversation with somebody about climate change based on your climate fashion. And the last few that I'll show you do have to do with road salt. We have worked on road salt for a long time, not me, but my colleagues, as mentioned. And part of that has to do with monitoring through our Adirondack Lake Assessment Program, which has tracked a variety of indicators in many lakes throughout the park for a couple of decades, chloride being one of them. These are the chloride data for Rich Lake, right in the central part of the Adirondacks, a lake by which Route 28N is really close and is one of the lakes in our long-term monitoring program where we do see a significant increasing chloride trend. I just took those data and put it on the back of a frog because I'm a wildlife person. And so this is meant to make you think about, the impacts of chloride on our amphibian populations. Of course, we know that there are important impacts from, throughout the aquatic food web and to human health as well from this particular threat. So that's my salted frog. And then last, I'll talk for a minute about Mirror Lake. I think you had the Salt Summit in Lake Placid, so everybody knows well about probably our research in Mirror Lake, but this is among, I think it's the most heavily developed lake in the Adirondacks by some measures anyway. It's a small lake and it has a variety of impacts. It's sort of the center of the town of Lake Placid. This is a piece that's just showing the bathymetry of Mirror Lake rendered in these little crochet circles just for fun, but basically to mimic the ASRA's beautiful map there. But Brendan and his colleagues in our our A-Lab program have been looking at road salt in Mirror Lake for a long time and published this paper in Lake and Reservoir Management a couple of years ago, showing that the accumulating chloride in the bottom of that lake actually is interfering with the lake turnover process. And so the graphic on the top there, the highly colored one is, Brendan knows how to make these really cool graphics in R. I wish I could learn how to do that. But showing you the chloride levels starting in 2016 and going, I think it's 2020, and the accumulation of salt, the high chloride at the bottom of the lake, which actually is preventing the turnover. So the lake didn't turn over in 2017, 18, 19, and same thing might have happened in 2021, I can't remember. So the bottom is just me attempting to represent that in fiber art. Just because I think these are beautiful diagrams on their own, but then if I can turn them into yarn, they're even more fun, and people tend to sort of gravitate toward those. What you may not have seen is some of his more recent information, which is showing that the work that the town and the village of Lake Placid are doing to reduce salt loads into that lake, there's a variety of actions being taken. It is working. So this is one of Brendan's GAM models, and the blue is showing a significant sort of downward trend in the chloride levels in the lake in the last couple of years. It's still really high, though. If you look at the bottom, he takes that same graph and puts it sort of on the scale of where we are, which is still up at 40 milligrams per liter, and where we would like to be, which is much, much lower. In 1974, I think the level was 4 in Mirror Lake. So Brendan and his colleagues are making recommendations now for additional work that would need to be done in Mirror Lake that could be instituted to get the lake maybe down to 10, which would be much more protective of aquatic life in that lake. So that is your brief tour of the Wool and Water Project. I will say that I talked mostly about the winter pieces, but there's all kinds of stuff in this collection. There's other pieces too that have been made by people other than me. I'm primarily a knitter or crocheter, but I have a woman that's beading, needle felting, weaving, all kinds of really cool stuff that I don't know how to do, but I'm happy to learn. It is a project that I would love to have more people involved in. So if you do any of these things or know folks that do, I encourage you to take a look at our website. If you go to the AWI website and pull down our community tab, you'll see a whole page dedicated to this project and sort of more information than you probably would ever want to know about all the pieces I just talked about. There's a virtual kind of exhibit there, and a bunch of tools for how to get involved. If you know somebody that might be involved, there are data sets to play with, there are instructions for how to get started. I'm also interested, if none of this is particularly your thing, but you know somebody that might be interested in the exhibit, I'd love to know that too, because we do have support from the Basin Program to travel it around within our region. If you're a scientist who has data set that you'd love to see represented in yarn, I'd love to know that too. And last, if you are a fiber producer or know a fiber producer in our region, that's another thing that we're trying to do, is to highlight local fiber and use it as much as we can in this project. Thank you.
If there are any questions, yes, we have.
Where can we see these? Do you have an exhibit somewhere now?
The next place the exhibit will be is at the Saranac Lake Free Library during the month of November. In the wintertime, in January, February, it'll be at the Waylandsburg Grange / Wickham's Garage, which is an art space near there. It'll be at St. Lawrence University at the Brush Gallery in March and early April. Other than that, I'll probably take it back to the Paul Smith Vic at some point this winter, and anywhere else that anyone who's interested. We're sort of in a continual process of working with folks to see who might be interested.
I think we did have a catalog or a cut sheet in the packet that we sent out to everybody or for attending. So
I have a general scientific question. You and your colleagues, when you get together and you brainstorm, are there any concerns about what's happening out west to the lakes and in Colorado and California, where all they're losing ground, they're dissipating? That could possibly happen on the East Coast? Because I looked at your snowfall levels, and it appears that they're gradually going down. And that's what happened out in California. The snowfall levels went down, and their lakes also went down at the same time. So I'm curious if you and your folks, when you get all the scientists get together around the table, if you folks ever discuss that or not.
We haven't discussed that specifically, although I share your concern, and certainly reading almost on a daily basis about what's happening out there is really terrifying. I think we, as an organization, think a lot about, climate change and what that means. Generally, I think our context in the Adirondacks is different. We have more water and more groundwater. That maybe that's not as much of a concern, but I definitely think that these broad scale changes like that are completely terrifying to think about. And fire is another one that comes up often. As we think of the Adirondacks as a place that doesn't burn, but our summers are getting kind of dry, where it's not outside the realm of possibility that we have some big changes like that.
Any other questions? If not, I think, thank you so much. I hope you found that interesting. I did. And when I first saw that, I just said, I've got to get you to the Salt Summit. So with that, we've reached our first break. We will be back at 9:30. Go out, make your calls, get some coffee, Danish, and we'll see you back in 20 minutes or so, thereabouts. Thank you very much. Thank you to all the presenters.